Hi there, this is a video presentation of an essay I'm writing on the Apostle Paul. The title being The Historical Paul Differs Radically from the Paul of Popular Christian Tradition. Can you distinguish between the man and the myth? Introduction. Who was Paul? Was he the founder of Christianity? A man who, like an ancient Christopher Columbus, took the gospel to new shores and liberated it from its old world confines in Israel? Was he the man who set us free from the bondage of Judaism, who single-handedly led God's people into the promised land of a law-free gospel? The popular understanding is that Paul of Tarsus turned to become the Apostle Paul, the ex-Pharisee, the ex-Jew, the ex-persecutor, and that this once hater of the nascent church turned into an arch-missionary, arch-theologian, architect of a new religion. Paul has even been seen as an arch-Protestant who, leaving behind his tortured struggles with the law, snatches hold of the message of Jesus, tears it from its legalistic Jewish roots, and replants it law-free in Gentile soil. Is this the man, or is this a myth? These are the kind of questions our discussion will explore, and what we will discover is that, as with many a myth, there is much truth to be had. That is there, but much that is unfounded and badly distorted. Right, our approach is going to be to divide this into three parts. Firstly, we'll discuss our sources and how reliable they may be, and then we will look at Paul's pre-Christian life, asking about his background in Judaism, and thirdly, his persecution of the church, and thirdly, we'll consider Paul's conversion and relationship to both Judaism and the Jerusalem church. Space militates against any lengthy consideration of his journeys and final days. Our sources on Paul are firstly his own letters, and secondly Luke's sequel to his Gospel, the book of Acts. Both of these are dated well within the 1st century Christian era, or the Common Era, and most scholars accept Romans, Philippians, Galatians, Philemon, 1 and 2 Corinthians and 1 Thessalonians as authentic letters from Paul. And whatever our particular views, I hold the view that all of the so-called Pauline letters are Pauline letters. However, because of the way that most scholars don't hold that same view, we will limit our discussion to just those letters we have in common. It is generally considered good historical practice, ceteris paribus, to place primary sources above secondary, and so Paul's letters are generally given priority over Luke's account. There is debate about how much we ought to rely on Luke's portrait of Paul in the Acts, and Luke has his detractors, but he also has strong defenders. Morna D. Hooker sees Acts as giving us a questionable picture of Paul in certain respects, seeing Luke as inaccurate over the number of visits he made to Jerusalem, and particularly in his attempt to smooth over any disagreements or tensions between Paul and the Jerusalem community, and Peter in particular. She also raises questions about whether Paul would, as self-understood apostle to the Gentiles, delay preaching to them, as you tend to get more picture in Acts, until he first preached to the Jews on each occasion, although I see no particular reason why Paul would have thought of this in some kind of antithetical way. Hooker also comments that Luke writes history from a particular point of view and with a particular purpose in mind. And she rightly points out that we can compare his Gospel, the Gospel of Luke, with the other synoptics, Matthew and Mark, and since they have differing angles on identical events, so would Acts had there been a parallel Acts written. I think this is a good point. However, it seems to me that we must avoid both the scylla of naive confidence on the one hand, the one danger to avoid, and kind of having a naive confidence in the objectivity of historians, and the Charybdis of exaggerated historical subjectivity on the other. If, however, the point is that Luke is writing with a theological agenda as a historian, this is theological history, not to be trusted, but he's writing Christian propaganda, as Hooker puts it, we want to keep that in mind, but we also need to avoid the logical error of assuming that actual events and theologically interpreted history must necessarily be mutually exclusive. I. Howard Marshall of Aberdeen, however, discusses the positive conclusions of historians like Colin J. Hamer and A.N. Sherwin-White of Oxford University, and notes the latter's high regard for Luke's accuracy over detail as suggestive of broader accuracy. It might be objected, of course, that background accuracy could be present in a historical novel. It doesn't guarantee the truth of the content, but Marshall argues the anachronism of such a view. Acts is not written in a period of this kind of writing, it's not this kind of book. Horrell concludes that serious and careful arguments are mounted on both sides, and it is widely agreed that the evidence of Acts cannot simply be dismissed. It is my view that while Acts is secondary, it is arguable that Luke, in principle at least, could bring a perspective free from the personal acts that Paul has to grind against his opponents. And whether he thinks he has that or not, at least in principle, we've got some independent witness here in Luke. Let's now look at Paul's life before Damascus, the pre-Christian, as it were, Paul. His birth, upbringing, his education. Paul, it is generally accepted, was born in Tarsus, but we only gather this information from Luke. Yet it is not seen as controversial, whereas his upbringing and education is. Many scholars have doubted Luke's idea that Paul would have been brought up from childhood and educated in Jerusalem, educated at the feet of Gamaliel. Although Hengel's work, Martin Hengel, a German scholar, has made that harder to deny now. Hooker considers it certainly possible, but queries it on the basis that Paul uses the Greek scriptures, the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, in quotations, whereas were he to have been raised in Jerusalem, she argues, it would have been the Hebrew scriptures. But this objection has largely been overturned by Martin Hengel's discussion of the presence of Hellenistic, that's Greek, synagogues in Jerusalem, and the fact that a sizable percentage of Second Temple documents, literature, were written in Greek. Paul describes himself as a Pharisee. I'll stop there and just come back to that because we're running out of time for downloading.